is a fascinating beverage with a seemingly endless amount of flavor combinations. Even within a specific style, the blend of malt, hops, and yeast can be varied to produce any number of flavors that still qualify as appropriate. Of course, there are some flavors that can occur in beer that are by and large viewed as undesirable, one of which many claim tastes like artificial butter. You're listening to the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and on this episode, contributor Malcolm Frazer is with me to chat about what I think is possibly the most frequently cited off flavor in beer evaluation.
Yeah, I mean, if you judge at any competition, someone at your table or the table next to you is going to be claiming they taste diacetyl. Someone will lament that they can't taste it or smell it, and then someone else will pronounce it completely differently. So it's diacetyl, diacetyl, diacetyl.
Yeah, you know what? I was going to ask you how do you say it? Do you say diacetyl or diacetyl or?
You know, I go back and forth. I think I mostly say diacetyl. All I know is this: is if you get enough beer people around, you say it your way, someone else will pop up around the corner and say it a different way. And then he or she will claim it's because they know better because they have letters after their name, or they know someone who has letters after their name.
Yeah, who told them that the way they say it. Well, one thing I can say with a fair degree of certainty is that butter flavors in beer, even those styles the BJCP says it can be appropriate in, does not appeal to me. I know the BJCP says that like certain English styles can have a little hint of diacetyl, and even there, it doesn't sound very appealing. We're going to be going over this off flavor, how it's formed, and ways to avoid it, as well as some interesting experiment results in this episode. To anyone who lives around any of us, though, we'd love to get you involved as a participant. We've got contributors in Anchorage, Alaska, Chicago, Illinois, Denver, Colorado, Auburn, New York, Atlanta, Georgia, and Fresno, California. You can email me, marshall@brewlosophy.com, and I'll connect you with the contributor closest to you. If you want to help us just continue producing this show, you can head over to brewlosophy.com/support, where you'll find a list of links to use when you do your online shopping. You can also receive rewards in return for your support by becoming a patron of Brewlosophy over at patreon.com/brewlosophy. Rewards include things like access to the Brew Crew private forum, unpublished recipes, and rad discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com. For a pledge of just $3 a month, you'll be invited to attend a monthly live Q&A session with some really, really neat folks. Coming up in November, we've got Dr. Charlie Bamforth from the UC Davis Brewing Program, the Pope of Foam, as it were. Really, really great guy who's going to be answering questions for about an hour. In the coming months, we've got Vinny Chilurzo from Russian River Brewing Company, Annie Johnson from Pico Brew, and John Kimmich from The Alchemist. All great people. For those patrons pledging at the $5 level or higher, you're entered into a monthly drawing for a $50 gift certificate from our friends at lovetobrew.com. Again, you can learn more about becoming a patron over at patreon.com/brewlosophy. Feedback this week is brought to you by Imperial Yeast, who are packing 200 billion cells of the purest yeast into each pitch-right pouch. They have a bunch of killer strains to choose from: lagers, clean American ales, Belgian, and even some funkier stuff. With the growing popularity of Kveek, we've got some experiments coming up using their new A43 Loki strain, which can apparently tolerate some pretty warm temperatures. Go check out all they have to offer at imperialyeast.com and snag some for yourself at More Beer and Great Fermentations. This is listener Francisco Jones wrote in with a note on IBU calibration in Beersmith. He says, I was just listening to your Brew&A number 6 in the car, and I heard you guys talk about calibrating Beersmith with your system utilization so that IBU predictions are better. You were talking about it in a rigorous and scientific way, which would have been really accurate, but made doing such a thing very complicated. I did my calibration in a simpler way that required less effort and gives good results. For years, I felt like I wasn't getting the bitterness in the finished beer that the software predicted. So finally, I started jacking the IBUs up to the high end of the range artificially during the planning phase, then tasting the resulting beer. My beers were getting the bitterness I expected, so I just compared the setting I had to use to boost the IBUs up with the quote normal setting required for the style under ideal conditions, and derived a percentage change. On that basis, I put in one correction to my software, and voila, my IBU predictions have been much, much better. I no longer have to boost it up high in the allowable range to get results. One data point, taste buds only, boom, done. So this seems a little bit odd to me, only because it seems like, and I'm glad it's working out for you, Francisco, but it seems like if bitterness, it almost seems to be making bitterness relative, if that makes sense. Kind of like it's only going to work for one person's taste buds based on the settings that they put in their calculator, Beersmith for Francisco. But that's not going to necessarily relay over to actual like IBU measurements. And so, this is definitely in the camp of do what works for you. If it works, I'm just not sure it can be applied to everyone.
You have to brew it and taste it and then adjust. So you brew, you take notes, you share, you take notes, and then you adjust next time. Unless you're going to get it actually measured by a lab, you're going by perceived bitterness. So there you go. It's all perceived bitterness. So if you think if you're getting 40 for beer X, recipe X with your equipment, and you find that not to be bitter enough for your IPA, then next time make an adjustment. Either shoot for 50 or mess around with your calculator, utilization. But it all comes down to perceived bitterness when you're home brewing. And I guess that's the point I'm trying to make is who cares what the calculator is saying the IBU is. No need to change it if it's not linked or to an actual measurement, I guess. But hey, again, Francisco, do what works for you. It sounds like you're happy with the outcomes, and that's what matters. So, well, if you have any show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or leave us a voice message by calling 951-444-0320. All right. I don't drink or brew many Belgian styles, not necessarily because I don't like them. I'm just not a huge fan of having 5 gallons on tap. This makes it all the more exciting, however, when I get to try Belgian beers brewed by other people, like the Belgian Golden Strong sent in by listener Danzy Nickel.
1 minute beer review with Jersey and Tim.
Oh, look at that. How about a nice, crisp, clean Pils?
That looks nice.
Let's just drink this Pilsner down and then not even review it because we know.
Yeah, we don't need to do
what
anything.
We've been served.
Yeah.
Ooh, nope. It's got some other shit going on, but it's pretty much.
They all got other shit going on.
I don't like it.
Oh no, that's terrible.
I don't like it.
It's not terrible. It's
not terrible. It's very European-y. Don't do it.
You peed in my beer.
No, don't do it.
You peed in my beer.
It's like all those German beers that I hate.
It's trying to be like an IPA.
No, it's not. You're trying to what?
It's bitter.
No, it's not bad. Maybe it's not bad. It's like those German beers, dude. There's all these German beers that taste all weird.
It's got like at the end, like this soapy aftertaste.
Soapy. Yeah, you're going back to your roots. Full circle.
I don't mind the first taste, but then like the lingering.
I don't like the first taste, the middle taste, the last taste. Like this, you don't need to do this in beer. Yeah. It can just be crisp and clean with a lot, less flavor. It doesn't have to be like this. I don't like it. But you know what? It could possibly be that this is a delicious and fantastic beer, and we are just cretins.
Well,
nope, that's not it. This beer sucks.
All right, let me read to you about this beer. This is a Belgian Golden Strong. So
Europe.
You said European-y. If you had said Belgian-y, you'd have been right, Jers.
Oh, yeah, come on, I can't nail down.
Yeah.
You know how many countries are in Europe?
Yeah, you're right. It's European-y. You're right. So this comes from Danzy Nickel from Hutchinson, Kansas. He says this beer has placed several times and has received rankings in the mid 30s to low 40s, which is good. I always enjoy telling people that this is a 30-minute mash, 30-minute boil beer. Yes, inspired by Brewlosophy podcast, he says. In fact, if I wasn't a short and shoddy and so electric BIAB, brew in a bag brewer, I may have given up the hobby since I am a father to 4 kiddos under the age of 11. Danzy, dude, I can relate. I've got 3 kids under the age of 11, so not so far off.
God damn it, delete that, dude.
Hey, listen.
It's a good beer for the style, I'm sure. We're just idiots and we don't like
if he's
it.
got 4 kids, I mean.
Yeah,
No,
dude.
so here's what I'll say. Here's my review of this beer. I'm not a big Belgian beer fan. I know a lot of people who are not big Belgian beer fans, and you too. In my experience with the two of you, you're not big fans of Belgian beer unless there's spice in it. So this is an interesting one because as a judge, I am a certified BJCP judge. As a judge, I would say...
What? Certified douche. Anyways, keep going. Go on with the chlorophyll.
This beer is... for the style is so spot on. It's delicious for the style. It's not a beer that I would drink a ton of. I kind of agree with you guys. I get like a soapy thing in the finish, but I get that with almost all Belgian, of bigger Belgian beers. So Tim, when you say soapy, what do you mean?
It just lingers on, and it's something I don't want to taste after I finish drinking it.
Like when your mom rinsed your mouth out with soap.
That
Okay,
never
she never
happened.
did. It
He
never
wasn't
happened,
alive
but-
in the 30s. It's just, dude, it's just, like I don't know how to describe it, but having been in Europe so many damn times in the last 5-6 years, I know immediately when I'm drinking that kind of beer, and I just don't like it. It's got that weird finish.
I think what you guys are referring to is this is serious, a phenolic, which phenolics tend to be spicy, kind of like clove kind of clove, peppery, like black pepper, white pepper type thing.
We'll go there.
maybe.
Yeah,
I just,
and it lingers for a bit, and I get that as well. It's one of the
just
reasons
that
I'm not a big fan of
aftertaste.
Belgians. But as far as Belgian Golden Strongs go, I got to say, kudos to Danzy, because this is a really good beer.
I've had worse.
It's just not my. I
It's
knew
not
the
me.
style
It's
immediately
not
when I
me.
tasted it, and it doesn't mean that it's. I mean, like you said, it's probably amazing at what it's trying to do. It's just not my thing, man.
Well, it was a solid beer, that's for sure. I actually did quite enjoy it, particularly given the style. Soapy, I guess I can sort of see where Tim was coming from with that. Malcolm, is that a character you've ever gotten in beer before?
Soapy, yeah, but I usually attribute it to highly hopped, especially highly late hopped beers. A lot of people, if they have their sulfate and chlorides off and they're just throwing in a ton of late hop, sometimes you get soapy. And a lot of people used to characterize IPAs as, they all taste soapy to me. So I usually think of that as hoppy beer, especially West Coast.
Yeah.
But I see it coming back around now with the massive amount of late hopping people are doing with New England IPAs. Some of those can get into that soapy range too. Belgians, I usually think of as spicy, and sometimes poorly made ones are too sweet. So then you have spicy sweet, and it just seems odd.
Yeah.
I didn't have this beer, of course, but it sounds like it was, from your description and how they're describing it, other than the soapy thing, it sounds like it was pretty good beer.
Yeah, it was a great beer.
Just not one they like is all.
Yeah, just not a style they were really into. And I'll be honest. I mean, Tim used to basically say every beer that had any amount of hops in it was soapy. So he's been, he's kind of peeled away from that. So good on him. The beer I thought again was really good, and I appreciate the fact that Danzy sent it in. If you want your beer or any other fermented beverage that you make or feel like sending in to us to be reviewed by Jersey and Tim on the show, you can email me, Marshall@brewlosophy.com, and I'll get you all set up. All right, when we come back, Diacetyl.
Hi, I'm Stephen Leach, creator of Brow Supply Brewing Systems, here to tell you about our latest Unibrow brewing system. Modeled after the brew-in-a-bag method, the Unibrow uses the same kettle for both mashing and boiling, replacing the fabric bag with a stainless basket that can hold up to 20 pounds of grain. A heating element is run by an electric controller that allows for the maintenance of specific mash temperatures and makes mashing easier than ever. Each Unibrow is shipped with a counterflow chiller and the parts required to brew a batch of beer. We're really proud of the Unibrow, and we know you'll love it as much as we do. Go check it out at browsupply.com and sign up for our email list to receive special deals in your inbox.
Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD. That's BRUPOD at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world. Carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear, Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com, and be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. It wasn't long after I started brewing that I began digging into all of the things that could go wrong with beer and the consequent flavors produced. I definitely learned about Diacetyl, but it wasn't until I joined a homebrew club where members regularly provided verbal evaluations of beers that it occurred to me that this particular off flavor was perhaps more common than others.
It seems, pretty much every time you're with a bunch of home brewers, someone's claiming diacetyl. It's just like it's up there with astringency, and now maybe oxidation,
So, DMS. I always hear DMS as well. Yeah.
And those are the ones that are people who are trained as beer judges. Or if you get into, Cicerone, studying for that, or any beer education, those are the heavy hitters. So those are the ones that get talked about a lot. And diacetyl is very common because it's ubiquitous in fermentation, right? So if you ferment, with brewer's yeast, you will create diacetyl. It's part of the anabolic pathway on the way from sugar to ethanol. So whether or not you make enough of it that can be then mopped up by the yeast, or if you have yeast that's healthy enough to then, take it back in and reduce it at the end of fermentation, that's the story. So I think, especially early on in home brewing, 80s and 90s, when I think we had more yeast problems, I think diacetyl was much more prevalent than it is today. That's my guess.
And that's an interesting. I kind of had a similar thought as well. And I wasn't around drinking homebrewed beer back in the 80s or early 90s. But I can't help but wonder if that's where the problem was identified then, and it became an issue that people were aware of, and that they learned these ways of dealing with it, which we'll talk about in a bit. But the fact of it being a prominent issue in beer kind of just stuck around, despite the fact that maybe it's not as big of an issue anymore. What is it about? I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about like the chemical properties of what diacetyl is. I know that it gets, people refer to it as tasting like butter, or butter flavoring.
So you really can't talk about diacetyl without talking about VDK, which is vicinal diketone. So the two main ones are diacetyl, also 2,3-butanedione. And then the other one is 2,3-pentanedione. So butane is 4 and pentane is 5. And it's vicinal diketone is the class of the compound. Vicinal is adjacent, di is 2, and ketones are a group of oxygen double bonded with carbon, in this chain. So that's the nerd stuff there for you. Now they happen to interact with our senses, both, aroma and that begets flavor. So as butter, and then depending on the level, it can either go rancid butter, butterscotch. If it's in concert with other sweet characters, we tend to think butter plus sweet is butterscotch or caramel.
Right.
Pentanedione, the other VDK, tends to be floral honey in low amounts, but there's actually a few flavor houses that will use 2,3-pentanedione for butter as well, just in higher concentrations. And then those on the metabolic pathway, they get reduced, taken back up by yeast, and they become acetoin. And acetoin also is used in many flavor houses for butter. So they're all in that same category.
Yeah.
But diacetyl gets all the press because it's made in slightly higher concentrations, and it's 10 times more, we are 10 times more sensitive to perceiving it. So less or more of it, and then less is needed for it to show up. And so diacetyl gets a lot of the press,
Yeah,
But
yeah.
One of the things in large breweries, what they do is they measure total VDK. So that's all the vicinal diketones left over after fermentation. And then also they'll activate precursors, which we can talk about later, and see how many of those precursors then convert to VDK. That's usually post packaging,
Sure.
or at the end of fermentation. Because very, very large breweries, they can track VDK production on a timeline, and they use it to track both fermentation, just like we do with gravity at the homebrew level,
Yeah.
but also yeast health. Because they plot a curve, and they're using gas chromatography. They plot a curve, and once that curve starts to shift, they know it's either health of the yeast, or something's happening with oxygen, or something's happening with their malt, so the nutrient level.
Yeah.
So it's a great way to track, because it's like the canary in the cave. So if you start seeing a diacetyl timeline shift, it makes you go, oh, something's up.
Yeah. Well, so we're talking a little bit about more of the objective ways to measure VDKs and in particular diacetyl in beer. Perceptibly, obviously you got the butter flavor thing. And I like what you said about how the diacetyl actually works in concert with other maybe even other flavors that you want to be in your beer, but you put a little bit of diacetyl in there and it gets perceived as this kind of off character.
Or a pleasant one, right? Like if you're having
sure.
a Scottish beer, perhaps, or even an English ale, if there's a little tiny bit of diacetyl, and then some of those, in my opinion, pleasing toffee caramel malts, and we're talking small amounts here, it can actually add some nuance and some character. Now, once you start being able to say there's diacetyl in this beer, just like Belgian spicing, there's too much.
Yeah. Well, and what I was going to bring up is that I've heard this thing, and I'll admit I used to tell people that this is how I experienced it as well, that diacetyl on a perceptible level can be experienced as creating kind of a slickness on the palate, kind of like an oiliness in your mouth or on your tongue.
So I think that's overstated. Personally, I've seen all sorts of numbers. So I'm not going to quote numbers on when that perceptibility becomes perceptible. Huh? So at what milligram per liter, blah blah blah. I've seen it all over the map. But Chardonnays sometimes do have a slickness to them. California Chardonnays.
Sure.
And that's like we're talking in the ppm level. And normally when we're talking about diacetyl, we're talking the ppb level.
Parts per billion as opposed to million. Yeah.
So, the commonly stated threshold is somewhere between 20 and 60, and it's when people say threshold, it's really tough because what they do is they have a trained panel and they say, okay, here's the bell curve. And this is where most people pick it up. But it's going to depend on obviously the person. But if you assume for a given person, it's also going to depend on the beer, right?
Sure.
So American light lager versus a stout as an extreme example, or porter, obviously it's going to be different. And we've used the analogy before. You're talking at a comfortable level in a church, or you're talking at a comfortable level in a rock concert.
Yeah.
So let's just assume it's like 50 ppb, somewhere around there. You can start to detect it, unless you are, of course, genetically blind to it. And I've seen quotes there as much as 25% of the population, which anecdotally I have not observed that. I've done a lot of classes, and there's usually one or two people, but these classes are often 15, 20, 30 people. So my guess would be it's somewhere around 10, maybe 20% of the people have a blindness to it, or maybe such a lack of sensitivity to it that they're considered blind to it.
That's interesting. Yeah. So at about 50 parts ppb, to just get back to the, I kind of have to go here. You know me, Malcolm.
Yeah, go for it.
There's a part of me that's curious if the slickness thing isn't more just an allusion to the fact that it tastes like butter, and maybe there's an element of that, like butter is an oil basically. If you just were to eat a pat of butter, it would leave your mouth feeling slick. In beer, I say that because in beers that are known to, where everyone's kind of agreeing at least that there's a good amount of diacetyl, I've never really experienced it as the slick, or in the slick way that I used to think maybe I would.
Yeah,
so
I would think if you have a perceptible amount of diacetyl, there's going to be gobs of it. It'll be more offensive to the aroma and flavor than it would be on slickness.
Yeah,
I could be wrong there. I like being proved wrong by example, so come bring give me a beer that has that in it. So a lot of the research, if you do a lot of research on wine, is where you can get some of that. There's wine articles I've read where they said, it can't be detected up until this level, so go look at what that level is. And they say that it can be detected by sensory, tactile mouthfeel,
sure,
versus organoleptic nose, aroma, flavor. So but there's no tongue taste for butter. There could be tongue taste for fat, but there's no tongue taste for the aroma compounds that are butter. So
yeah.
It's our sensory olfactory senses saying this is butter.
Yeah, that's kind of my thinking on it too.
Yeah. And a lot of the beers that would have it tend to have more of a mouthfeel for other reasons. So, English beers aren't as dry as German beers. German beers, I would say, stereotypically no diacetyl.
Yeah, right.
English beers have more a higher finishing gravity, often, not always, but often. And same thing with Czech lagers. Czech lagers are said to have some of it, and I believe that it's perceptible. So they have a finishing gravity, half Plato higher than the standard German equivalent,
Sure.
counterpart of a lager. So I wonder what you're saying is true. Is it like, well, because the beers that often have it are higher gravity, do we think it has a slickness? But like I said, go check some wine studies, and there appears to have been studies that say, yes, you can detect it, but at that point, it would be so aromatically offensive.
Yeah. Well, I was drinking just this weekend. I was drinking a cheap red wine, and I thought I picked up in kind of a buttery flavor, and I couldn't help but kind of question my perception there, because I'm thinking, well, red wines tend to be barrel aged for a little bit. Maybe I'm just picking up some barrel character or something, and my mouth, right. And I just feel like it's easy to confuse that stuff. Before we get into talking about ways to avoid it or things that it might be mistaken for, how exactly, like in what part of the process is diacetyl created in brewing? My understanding is that it's very fermentation specific. It's something that comes because of the microbiology of beer. Yeah.
So we touched on it in the beginning, but for brewer's yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, on its pathway from sugar, you're going to create pyruvate. Down to ethanol, you have like an intermediary, which is acetolactate. And it's basically, it's the yeast biosynthesis of creating amino acids for itself, for part of its growth and for part of its metabolism. So if there is a dearth of essential amino acids, and often called like FANs, free aminos. If there's a lack of strain dependent, if there's a lack of amino acids, then it will synthesize them themselves. And in that process, from pyruvate to the amino acid, you get acetolactate, and acetolactate will, if it's not all used up, it will excrete itself out of the yeast cell. And then that becomes diacetyl through a non-enzymatic reaction outside the yeast cell. That is an oxidative reaction. So it's called oxidative decarboxylic reaction. So acetolactate to diacetyl. And then same thing, instead of it being alpha-acetolactate, it's hydroxybutyrate. And that becomes the other VDK, which is 2,3-pentane-dione.
Right. I'm going to take your word for that.
It's confusing. It really is.
So confusing.
And I have to draw myself pictures when I talk about it. I'm like a picture pages guy. So if I'm teaching a class, I do the timeline, or I do the line, because it allows me to more easily think about it.
Sure. Well, what's the well, I know that I don't know this, but I've heard that. So if you're going to make like a traditional, let's say a Flemish red or an Oud Bruin or something like that, traditionally speaking, there's going to be a fair amount of pediococcus that you use in the souring process. I've heard that pediococcus is a big time diacetyl producer, and that that aging is required for some of these traditional sour styles in order for that diacetyl to be metabolized.
Yeah, so a lot of traditional beer souring processes will use lactic acid bacteria, and pediococcus, prime among them, will produce diacetyl and other VDKs, but mostly diacetyl. And that's not just pediococcus; it's primarily pediococcus, but there are certain strains of LAB, lactic acid bacteria, that also create that buttery flavor, and acetone as well, through the pathway. The funny thing is I've talked about it before. I think during one of our experiments with lactic acid, liquid lactic acid, is some producers, they're less cognizant of it because they don't necessarily care about that. And I've had lactic acid bottles where I've opened it up and it smells like straight diacetyl, like just artificial butter. Yeah. And I've had other ones that don't. So it depends on what strain they're using and probably the environment in which they're synthesizing that lactic acid,
That is, I was just talking with somebody about your experience with the lactic acid that smells like butter. That's something I've never experienced before, or that aroma, at least, off of lactic acid. To me, it just smells like lactic acid. But I'd never actually put it together that in the production process for lactic acid, they're using lab, basically.
Yeah, they're synthesizing. You have these bioreactors, right? So if they use this strain versus that strain, that's going to change it. Or if they're using a different medium in which they are synthesizing this reaction, you know, obviously depending on the amino acids available, that could change. And that might not be a concern of theirs. Their goal might be make lactate ions, right? And then these other things occur. So you can imagine, you know, if depending what you're using that lactic acid for, you might say, no, I need a very pure, you know, lactic acid, just liquid full of lactate ions. But other processes might just be like, I don't care about that, you know? So I just found that from this one manufacturer, from time to time, it would show up full of, and to my perception, artificial butter flavor, you know? And funny enough, you talked about, you know, where those flavors are used, and they're used in baked goods, they're used in candy, they're used in yogurt, they're used in buttermilk, they're used in, you know, and just about anywhere where you want that character, you know. They even use so artificial fake butter, you know, the margarine stuff, which is like the devil's work, by the way. And unfortunately, they just list it as artificial flavor. So it could be 2,3-pentanedione, it could be diacetyl, it could be acetone, you know.
Yeah,
but
it's interesting.
And the other thing too, you talked about it showing up, you know, because of bacteria. So obviously, purposeful bacteria, which is souring. If it's done in the presence of yeast, obviously the yeast can go reduce it afterwards. It brings it back up as part of its metabolic process to create energy stores.
Sure, yeah.
And that creates that then turns it over to acetone. And both 2,3-pentanedione and acetone have a much higher flavor threshold. So it kind of converts them over to these compounds, and we're less sensitive to them.
Yeah.
But the other thing is, one of the ways to find out if you have a bacterial infection is the ratio. So, you know, obviously we can't do this at home, but you can, in a lab, you can see what's the ratio of diacetyl 2,3-butadiene to pentanedione. And if it's opposite, because usually there's more diacetyl, if there's a lot more diacetyl, they can go, oh, this is almost definitely bacteria.
Huh. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, contamination is one of the areas that I was gonna bring up as well. That if you've got a contaminated batch, you've done all of the things we're going to talk about here in a sec. You know, to avoid diacetyl formation, you've done all of that right, and you know, a month after packaging your beer, you taste it and it tastes like a butter bomb. You know, my guess is going to be that that's going to be in conjunction with other indicators of a contamination, but that's another possible source of diacetyl. So, given the way that diacetyl is formed, what can we as brewers do? What are the methods that we can use or employ to make sure that we avoid diacetyl at all costs, particularly when we don't want it there?
The one thing that we can control is the yeast type. So, all things equal, so the wort, gravity, and the nutrient makeup, and then let's just assume it's the same fermentation process. You know, strain A versus strain B versus strain C of yeast, they may produce different amounts of diacetyl. So that's one thing. So now, if the strains are different, and let's just say they produce different amounts of diacetyl, or even the same amounts of, we'll say different amounts of diacetyl. If one strain is highly flocculent, it may drop out before it has the ability to clean up the diacetyl, bring it back into itself, and metabolize it to acetone. So if it doesn't do that, if it flocks out before the job is done, it may leave more diacetyl behind.
Is that one of the reasons that you think? Well, I mean, you got English yeast are known for being high flocculators. You know, they anybody who's ever brewed with the Fuller strain, has seen the egg drop soup. You know, and so, you know, the fact that it's you know, it can be appropriate to have maybe a whisper of diacetyl in some of these English styles. Is that perhaps because of the flocculation of the strain, or do you think those strains are genetically, they just produce more diacetyl? Maybe a mix of both. Yeah,
I don't know, you know, micrograms per liter of each yeast strain, so I imagine it's kind of a combo. Because warmer fermentation is another thing. So warmer fermentation, the higher fermentation favors diacetyl production, but it also favors diacetyl reduction, right?
Sure.
So you put more in, but you're able to take more out. Yeah. So if that balance, if the goes in and the goes out rate change, that's how you get leftover, you know, VDK, diacetyl. So what a lot of people will do, they'll say, we've heard of the diacetyl rest, right? So you ferment at whatever temperature, and so you've produced a amount of diacetyl that is coincident to that temperature. Now, about halfway through your fermentation, so a lot of people in the homebrew level do it at the end, but in the pro level, they recommend doing it about halfway through. So if you're going from 1050 to 1010, so 20 gravity points, 5 degrees Plato, through the fermentation, you raise the temperature 1 to 2 degrees Celsius, about 3 to 5 degrees, I think it's about 3 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit. And then that is increasing yeast metabolism to encourage the process of taking the VDK back into the yeast cell and converting it to acetone.
Yeah.
And then, so it goes acetone to 2,3-butane diol, which is another compound that has a low flavor impact and aroma impact.
Right. And yeah, again, I agree with you. I think the most common approach to do one of these diacetyl rests, in homebrewing at least, is, you've got maybe a point or two left, and you take your temperature. If you're doing diacetyl rests, I think are most common among those who are talking about lager beers who are fermenting cool. But I think a lot of us, even when we're making ales fermented at 66 degrees Fahrenheit, around 19 degrees Celsius, you still bump it up to 72 at the end just to encourage complete attenuation. And one of the other things there is that if there was any diacetyl created, that maybe it'll take it back up so that it's not in the finished beer. And I again, like you said, I think a lot of people are doing that towards the end of fermentation. I don't think there's much to be lost if you want to do it a couple days beforehand, before the end, because in my experience, what you end up doing is pushing the beer's completion a little bit sooner, and
you drive it.
Yeah, you're driving the finish of your fermentation. But the other kind of benefit is that you're driving that attenuation down, and you're kind of in my head at least, I'm ensuring that FG, the finishing gravity, when I take the measurement, that's the true FG, that I haven't left any residual sugars behind.
Yeah. So the thing that I think has changed, in my opinion, dramatically in the last 10, 15 years with the yeast companies making better yeast and giving us more of it. So they're making better, healthier yeast, getting it to us in better condition, and they're giving us a higher pitch rate so that there's a higher chance of more viable yeast.
Right.
Is yeast health. So at the end of fermentation, during this mop-up portion, if it's still excreting some of those precursors, then they're left over in the beer, but they haven't had time to change. So here you are, you have a beer, you smell it, you taste it, and it seems like, okay, there's no, because, at home we don't have a gas chromatograph, but we taste it, we go, okay, this is fine, we smell it, it's fine, we package it up, and then boom, it shows up, butter in my beer. Yeah. And what that is those precursors, alpha acetolactate and alpha hydroxybutyrate, those are changing in the presence of oxygen, and because of heat, they now change over to VDK. So beer seemed okay, butter shows up. And I see this a lot, and people hate to hear it, in these New England IPAs, because they rush them out the door. Yeah. And I'm telling you, man, I go to these, smaller places that have like the most happening latest New England IPA. And if you have it a couple of days later, the harshness settles down, like that hop bite, but I start getting diacetyl. It's bad.
That sounds terrible. Yeah,
I think that's the reaction. I think it's because they don't often have ideal packaging process. So in the presence of oxygen, so if there's more oxygen, this reaction is more inclined to occur. And then heat. So if it's not kept absolutely cold, so oxygen and heat encourage this precursor to then switch over, through a non-enzymatic oxidative reaction to diacetyl. So
one of the ways you're talking about heat, and one of the ways that homebrewers or anybody can test diacetyl levels. And this is one way that I was 100% certain there was diacetyl in a beer a friend of mine brewed. He was having some issues a couple years back. Is we took a sample of the beer and covered the glass with some foil, and then put that glass, just a little taster glass, in some hot water and let it sit for, 10 minutes and kind of warm up. And boy, I'll tell you, you take that foil off and you know right away if there's diacetyl in that beer or not.
You've converted those precursors. That's what you did. So yeah, you can do that in the microwave to take 20, 30 seconds. Just get it above, I think it's I'm guessing here, 140 degrees Fahrenheit, whatever that is, 50, I think. Check me out, someone. Celsius. So yeah, you just put it in the microwave, zap it 5-10 seconds, zap it again, until it's warm. So you take one cold from your keg or from a bottle and put it on the counter. Take the other one, put it in the microwave, zap it until 140, 150 Fahrenheit, and then smell the two. If the one that was heated smells decidedly more of butter, then that was because you had alpha-acetolactate hovering around in that beer. So unconverted precursors, and it would have shown up eventually. Just may have taken a while. If you kept it cold in your chest freezer keezer, it might have taken a much longer time, because obviously cooler temperature is going to retard that reaction.
Right.
So, but that's a simple way of seeing if you've allowed the yeast time to do all of its mopping up.
Yeah. It's a fun way to kind of check out to see, kind of self-test. It can also be kind of heartbreaking. So just before we head to break, just to kind of go over it sounds like there's three main things I think brewers can be cognizant of to ensure or to best kind of reduce the risk of creating diacetyl, and that's just quality yeast at healthy pitch rates, ramping your temperatures, towards the end, or maybe even in the middle of fermentation, and keep your brewing process clean. Don't get a contamination. I still feel like that is one of the primary sources for a lot of problems in brewing. So you mind those three things, and you're likely to at least reduce the risk of diacetyl production. Yeah.
Yeah. And if you're doing super high gravity beers, maybe use some yeast nutrient. Although with more malt usually comes more nutrients. So that's something we don't see very much on the homebrew side. Is if there's a decrease in quality of your malt, then that could be suspect. But that seems like the lowest probability for the home brewers.
Yeah.
And the other one is limit oxygen during packaging, of course. But that goes without saying, in my opinion.
Numerous problems from that.
Yeah. But I think the big ones would be healthy yeast. Give it time to do its thing. Diacetyl rest, good sanitation. Absolutely.
Amen. Well, we've done an experiment on diacetyl. We've got some other stuff to talk about as well as soon as we come back from this short break.
Compact and simple to use with a small footprint for brewing indoors, the Grainfather makes it easy for you to brew professional quality beers at home. The Grainfather is an all-in-one brewing system that lets you brew all grain beer in a single compact stainless steel unit. It uses an electric heating element and pump to maintain a constant temperature and to circulate the wort during the mashing and cooling stages. It also comes with a counterflow chiller to reduce chilling times and produce high-quality wort. And now, with the addition of their conical fermenter, the Grainfather takes things one step further by offering homebrewers state-of-the-art temperature-controlled fermentation just like commercial breweries use. And with the Grainfather Recipe Creator and Connect app, you can easily design a recipe, sync your brewing system with your phone, and then just sit back and relax as the app takes over and assures that you maintain your scheduled mash temps and boil schedule. Head to Grainfather.com to purchase your all-in-one brewing system today and to sign up for their free recipe creator tool. Once more, head on over to Grainfather.com, that's Grainfather.com, and get started today.
Shopping for brewing supplies online can be a real hassle, which is why we recommend Love to Brew. They've got great prices, super fast shipping, and they carry exclusive products like East Coast Yeast, the Brewer's Essentials brand, and their award-winning beer recipe kits. They're also the only place you can pick up your very own Brewlosophy recipe kit. The numbers don't lie. Love to Brew has hundreds of 5-star reviews, and thousands of brewers are choosing them for their supplies and ingredients each year. Experience the difference at lovetobrew.com. That's love, the number 2, brew.com. When dumping wort-soaked grain in leftover low-gravity wort while cleaning up after a brew day, did you ever wonder what your true efficiency would be if that wort made its way to the kettle instead? Using the brew bag, a fabric filter for all mash tuns and brewing methods, allows you to capture every last drop of wort. Not only does this increase kettle efficiency, it lowers your grain bill, which saves you money. Throwing wort in the trash is like dumping a 12-pack down the drain and just doesn't make sense. Use the brew bag and leave no wort behind. I've been using these filters for a long time and recommend them to everyone. I never have to worry about a stuck sparge and cleanup is fast and easy. Go grab yourself a brew bag fabric filter at brewinabag.com and be sure to use code TBP17 at checkout to get a discount on your order. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the super fast counterflow chiller, the exGEERimator, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to exGEERimator.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you. Well, it's no secret, as anyone who's been listening to this podcast is likely aware, that I have grown quite skeptical of tasting abilities of beer drinkers. I don't mean to be cynical, though perhaps that's how this is going to come across, but I have witnessed so many instances where somebody notices some off flavor, says that they are, perceiving some off flavor in beer, and usually says this with a fairly high degree of confidence, even though nobody else can detect it. We talked about this a little bit earlier. Again, I'm sort of wont to believe a lot of us take pride in our tasting prowess, and I get that, but that can kind of get in the way of reality. I've got a little story. This one has to do with an experience that I had here in town. I recall this one time during a club meeting where a friend of mine was sampling this ESB that somebody made. It might have even been a beer that I made. I forget. But everybody was kind of enjoying this beer. People had been passing it around. It was a well talked about home brewed ESB is what my recollection. And then it gets to this one person who's a good dude, great, great beer evaluator and all of that. Great guy. I'm not trying to diss him. But as soon as he, you hate him. As soon as he lifts this glass of beer to his nose, though, he just points out diacetyl. He says that, this diacetyl, and this is like 6 years ago. So, my memory's not perfect, but I remember this instance very well that, he says there's diacetyl. And I remember kind of having this shocked look like, what are you talking about? Everybody's been drinking this and nobody noticed diacetyl in this beer. This, of course, led to a conversation about this particular person's sensitivity to diacetyl. And you had talked about folks being kind of maybe blind to certain experiences, diacetyl being maybe one of them. But this person was claiming to be very sensitive to diacetyl. I accepted that, whatever. I wanted to quell any conflict. But I couldn't help but wonder if maybe I was missing something, or if perhaps like my friend was mistaking other characteristics for diacetyl. I learned over time, in fact, that this particular friend tended to detect diacetyl quite often in beers. As I got to, evaluate more and more beers with him, he was picking it up all the time. And again, I just couldn't help but wonder if maybe he was mistaking some other characteristic for diacetyl. Is that something you think can happen?
Well, no one sees more spiders than someone who's afraid of spiders. So if you're afraid of spiders, you're going to see them all the time.
That's true.
So maybe, yeah. So maybe because he thinks he's afraid of sensitive to diacetyl, he picks it up even when he doesn't. But or he could be very sensitive. There's people out there who literally can detect it like in the single digits to a ppb. That's the thing. There's people out there who are very sensitive to it. That's a small percentage of people, but what I found personal experiences is certain combinations of other flavors tend to make people think diacetyl, and without actually knowing if there is diacetyl in there, other than perception and trying to be as critical as my own ability as I can be, is oxidation and caramel malt together seems to give me the impression of diacetyl and 2,3-pentanedione, that honey toffee butter thing.
Yeah.
A lot of English beers, we talked about it briefly about how the toffee character, I think from the malts, I'm not sure if sometimes by themselves make you think diacetyl. So you think, oh, this is diacetyl. So some people will say, and I've heard this conversation multiple times at the judging table, well, just look for the mouthfeel. Is it slick on the mouthfeel?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just like, oh my God, stay in your lane, stay in your lane.
Well, no, I think you pointed out caramel malt or crystal malt, caramel malt. That's where I have a very difficult time. I mean, you think about what it's called. Caramel malt, and you take a beer, English or not, but you throw a pound or two of caramel malt at it, and it makes sense to me that people who are particularly interested, we'll say, in pointing out what it is that they're detecting in beers. We all know folks like this. It makes sense to me that they might call out diacetyl if there's a good chunk of caramel malt in a beer, especially if it's fermented with a yeast that tends toward a more malty character.
So there's a parlor trick involved there, so it's like taking the evidence that's given to you. It's like the old Sherlock Holmes movie or even the books really, where he's like deciphering the character and behaviors of this person based on everything given to him, the type of shoes, the type of watch, the manner of speak. So here you are with an English style beer, ESB, with these caramel type English toffee malts, and you go diacetyl. Well, you have a higher chance of being correct than if you did the same thing with a German lager.
Sure, that's a good point. Yeah.
So there's some parts of that, and we do it a lot when we do these blind tastings. When we have to for training tasters, is we'll ask someone, what beer is this? And the people in our group, the training group, we would seem like we're like these super tasters, but what we did was it was a series of deductions. This is not a Hefeweizen. It looks like one, so it's probably a wit beer. It's more pepper than it is coriander, so it's probably spicier. How's the attenuation? Okay, I think this is Allagash white. And they're like, oh my God, you're like a freaking wizard. And it's like, no.
that is kind of a neat magic trick. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's not. So same thing. If you have a beer that would, like we said, the ESB example, you have a higher chance of being right. So your guess could be right, and if it's a rookie brewer, maybe they're not as experienced yet. So maybe they did like, oh, I'm going to make this beer real quick. So I pitched a lot of yeast, yay me. It's an English strain. And then I start cold crashing it. Right.
Yeah.
And it's like, you didn't give it time to clean up, so they reached terminal gravity maybe, and they didn't give it time to clean up. So you flocked everything out. It's a flocculent yeast anyways, but you started getting it cold. So you slowed its metabolism, so it leaves some diacetyl behind,
Yeah.
So, once again, part of the deduction, if you're talking to a guy in your club or a woman in your club who happens to be an accomplished brewer, knows what they're doing, if you start to get diacetyl, you might start thinking to yourself, well, Jessica is she's a very good brewer, so this is probably not diacetyl, this is probably the malt. Now, you can't do that blind in a competition, but, talking to someone in a group, you can.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was thinking also in the way. I mean, it's hard to discuss, in my opinion, off flavors without. We just did these couple of episodes on bias in terms of perception, but you and I have been talking about doing some shows on different forms of logical fallacies and cognitive biases and how they play into beer. And you mentioned, rookie brewers, and who hasn't met the home brewer who started, 3 to 5 months ago, who is like and I'm putting this in quotes, an expert on every off flavor and can detect everything that's there and has had a million beers with acetaldehyde or diacetyl.
Yeah.
I think that plays into it. Another area I think people might misperceive in regards to diacetyl, at least, is when they know the style. And you were saying, you're more likely to be right by calling it out in certain situations. And I think one of those is, if I serve somebody a Bohemian Pilsner or a English mild or something, those are two styles where the term diacetyl is mentioned in the BJCP guidelines, like so you serve that, and if you've got somebody who's already thinking that they're sensitive to it, they're going to get closer to the bullseye if that's what you're serving them, and they know that that's the beer that they're drinking, the style of beer that they're drinking, maybe.
Yeah. So imagine, if you will, a fairly respected brewer / judge who has on numerous occasions claimed to be sensitive on diacetyl, and then he calls out or she calls out diacetyl in a beer, and then magically 2 or 3 people around them go, "Oh yeah, I get it too."
Oh yeah, can't imagine that happening. Yeah,
I've seen it happen. Yeah, and
everybody has. Yeah,
yeah, and you may or may not have been victim of it. It's a power of suggestion, So I'm sure I've been victim of it. Because now you're thinking like, I can't believe I can't detect it, and you're like, oh wait, maybe I can.
Yeah.
So,
well, and you're, and we all do this. We are not talking down on anyone. We're all human here, but that appeal to authority, looking at some, if I'm sitting at a table with Gordon Strong, and this is true story. We did this in New Zealand, and he picks up some characteristic in a beer that we're drinking together, and I'm not getting it. You better believe I'm either pretending I get it or I'm keeping my mouth shut. You know what I mean?
I don't pretend, because I've grown accustomed to being wrong enough that I'll just be like, I don't get it.
But, that's my take too. I would just enjoy the beer, but you've got these guys who are, he is an authority when it comes to beer evaluation, and to be sitting at a table with Gordon Strong and not detecting what it is he is detecting, people are influenced by that. I mean, that's undeniable, and I think it's interesting, at least. Well, we had the opportunity to actually do a legitimate experiment using a true diacetyl flavor standard from Flavor Active. And on this one, we've talked about the way we typically do these off-flavor experiments. I did the same thing with this one. I dosed some German lager. It was a Bitburger with this Flavor Active flavor standard to above threshold levels. Now, I don't know the exact ppb, but my understanding is that the amount that I used, it was based on Flavor Active's recommendations, took the flavor threshold to, or it was something like 3 times the flavor threshold. So it should make it fairly obvious for anybody to detect if it is a thing that people are easily able to detect. So on this one, I was able to get 19 participants. Every single one fit into they were either a BJCP judge, a certified Cicerone, or there was a couple of really experienced brewers as well. This isn't one that I just went and randomly got a random sample of beer drinkers at the pub. And I really wanted to see if people could detect this thing. I was most interested, obviously, in the BJCP judges. Unfortunately, my diacetyl detecting friend that I spoke of earlier wasn't able to make it. So people are probably, we're going to wonder if he was one of the ones who could detect it in this beer. I didn't serve this beer to him. So out of 19 people, in order for us to say that we got a significant finding, 11 people would have had to identify the odd beer out, which in this case, the odd beer out was the diacetyl dosed one. Again, all of these tasters were completely blind to what was going on. They just were served 3 beers in front of them and asked to identify the unique sample. 11 needed to do that in order for us to say it was significant. And in the end, 13 people were able to identify the odd beer out. So we could say with some confidence that people could detect the diacetyl dose beer out of a triangle where the other 2 didn't have any diacetyl, at least any, it had less diacetyl. I don't know how much Bitburger is actually, how much diacetyl is in Bitburger, but
I would imagine under 10 ppb.
Oh, it's got to be, right? I mean, that's a big mass-produced a German lager. Yeah. So the follow-up question, we asked tasters to answer a few more questions in regards to their preference. 9 out of the 13 people said that they liked the non-dosed sample better, but 4 people, I thought this was interesting, 4 people, before knowing what the variable in this experiment was, 4 of the people who were able to identify the unique sample thought that the one with diacetyl was better. They preferred that one. And 4 people accurately identified diacetyl as being the off flavor out of those 13. And then the rest spanned it. It was you got 3 people thought it was chlorophenol, 2 people thought it was oxidation, and 1 person thought it was metallic. So you've got 9 people preferring the non-dose sample, 4 people liking the diacetyl sample. And then you've only got 4 out of 13. And this is, I think it's interesting. Only 4 people were able to identify diacetyl as the off flavor that the beer was dosed with.
So they got it right that it was different, but they didn't know it was diacetyl.
Yeah, and these are all people who know what diacetyl is.
They do?
Yeah, these are people who, like I said, certified Cicerones, BJCP judges, and experienced brewers. These are people I would talk off flavors with.
But what I found also is that unless your recent experience with spikes is somewhat close, unless you do it all the time, just because you took a BJCP training course 10 years ago, doesn't mean you know what it is exactly, in my experience. So when we train people for the Cicerone exams, we would say, hey, do your flavor spike test, your study as close as possible to the exam, and use the same spikes that they use. Because like I said, some people will use 2,3-pentane-dione for their flavor spike for diacetyl.
Yeah.
In much higher concentrations. Now, I'm not going to say which ones do that or whatever, but most of the big ones do use the actual compound, 2,3-butane-dione. But you should just, practice like how you're going to play. So use the spike that you're going to be tested on. And like I said, if you haven't done the flavor spike in a long time, just because you know what diacetyl is, doesn't mean you know what the spike tastes like in Bitburger. Yeah, well,
so, the way I think about it as well is I'm not using this as a way to say people don't know what diacetyl tastes like. For me, it's if I serve a blind person, a person who has no idea what I'm serving them, I give them a pale ale, a blonde ale, and a German Pilsner. If I serve a panel of people those beers and they don't know, chances are not everybody is going to pick the style. Right. It's sort of the same way. It's just difficult to do that when there's so many things that it could be. Well, I know everybody is curious how I performed on this triangle test. Well, I've been drinking and evaluating beer for a really long time, and I like to think that I'm relatively aware of my tasting strengths and weaknesses. I mentioned earlier that I used to get like a slickness on my palate when I would have diacetyl and yada yada. I was pretty sure I'd experienced diacetyl in beer before. In fact, we did a test. A friend of mine, local friend of mine, Sean, when he was the club president, he brought some Coors Light to a meeting one time and dosed it with just a drop of like butter flavoring. And that tasted exactly like butter. There was no way anybody wasn't going to miss it. So I'd thought, based on that experience and some other experiences I'd had, that I had this ability to taste diacetyl. So, in this experiment, you got 13 out of 19 people who were able to identify the unique sample. I had one of them, a buddy of mine here in town, Matt Vaught. I had him serve me a series of blind triangles. And the way we do that, since I'm aware of everything, is I take 3 same colored cups and then we will mark the bottom of 2 of them. And then he'll mix them up, serve them to me in different order and whatnot. And so I was truly blind. I wasn't going to fake it here. Out of 6 attempts that I took, I chose the odd beer out exactly twice, which for those of you who are keeping track is no better than I'd do if I was randomly guessing, which is what I was doing. I simply could not detect with any confidence at all any buttery character, especially to the level that I was expecting based on how well all of my friends performed on this one. Talk about eye-opening. Yeah.
Well, you let's just say, for example, you're at average. So on average, people are average. You might just had a bad day, because do the same thing. I've done the same thing. We do flavor spike testing a lot. And some days I just can't detect certain things. It's whatever it is. Or if it's a certain beer. And sometimes the acetaldehyde or acetaldehyde gets me. I just can't find it. So I have to try to find the beer that's the control. Yeah. And then when there's one that I go, okay, I have 2 controls here, so one of them's not a control.
I was so stumped when I was tasting these beers and smelling them. I mean, the friends that were there. I mean, again, I did this, I think, in 2 sessions on the same day. So I had 2 groups of people come over to my place, and my buddy Matt, who was there, he's looking at me going, "You've got to be kidding me! It's so obvious." Right? And he always, this is a guy who, when he comes over, he likes to, especially when he gets the first round right, he likes to go and do a couple more triangles. Gloat. Yeah, well, he's not even gloating. He just wants to see for himself if it was a guess or not, and I appreciate that. Every single attempt that he took, it was just off of aroma alone. He's like, "It's that one. It's that one." I know for a fact.
Did you feel like you were staring at one of those pictures with all the pixels? And you're like, "I can't see the boat."
Yeah, like a magic guy.
Yeah.
I just couldn't get it, and I appreciate your vote of confidence. Maybe it was a bad day, but I'm sitting here, having maybe consumed an entire pint of beer the entire day.
No, trust me. I want to sit there and make fun of you, but this is for the listeners.
Thanks, man.
No, really. The reason why I want to say that is because everyone has bad days, and there's certain days when you can't. That's why it's good to taste in groups, because when you're having a bad day, you recognize it. You realize that, hey, I'm infallible here. I'm not perfect at this. And,
Yeah.
And there's days in certain beers you're like, I can't get this, and I could have swore a couple of days ago I was doing a similar exercise and I could get diacetyl. So it just happens,
Yeah.
It's one of those things. That's why those exams, like the advanced and master cicerone, and then the SOM exam, same thing. You studied for years potentially, and you have a bad day and it's gone.
Yeah.
It's like,
Screws
what
your
the
whole
hell?
goal. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, based on these results, we're coming up on the end of the show here. Malcolm, is there anything else you want to say? What does this stuff mean? I mean, I have a hard time, still kind of breaking away from my belief that people mistake other characters. I feel like the majority of the time people are calling out diacetyl, it's probably not there. Now, I know that sounds very skeptical and probably a little bit cynical of me. I've just seen it so often. And like you said, witnessing people changing their evaluation of something just because somebody who's been drinking beer longer than them found it.
I wanted to mention the other ones we talked about, caramel malt, but melanoidin malt and honey malt to me a lot of times tastes like oxidation.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it depends on, once again, the beer, so the other constituent parts, but also the amount used. Because it's kind of like super malty. Melanoidin's like malt plus, but and honey malt is often said to be fairly close to melanoidin. Sometimes, man, like I said, in all other regards, a pretty good brewer gives you a beer and it tastes a little bit like diacetyl, and you're like, this is probably not diacetyl.
That's kind of where my mind goes as well. And maybe I don't like it still, and that's okay. Maybe you don't like that melanoidin or that honey malt character or whatever caramel malt is used. But it doesn't have to be diacetyl. And I guess what I'll end with, Malcolm, and I'll let you have your final say, but you don't have to be the one person who picks out diacetyl to be cool, man. Like I'll be you're still not friends if you don't pick out diacetyl in every beer you drink. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Like everything else, it's only an off flavor if you don't like it or if you didn't want it there. So diacetyl in certain beers can be nice. If you're growing dandelions, then grass is the weed. So
there you go.
Yeah. So in a Bohemian Pils with a slight amount of diacetyl in combination with those decocted malt character, to me is buttery baguette, and it's delicious and heavenly. But I don't want that character in a German Pils. So.
Yeah. Well, as for me, I'll be doing all of the stuff that we talked about earlier to avoid diacetyl in every beer that I make, and that's just my preference. You can read more about the experiments that we talked about in this episode, as well as all the other stuff that we're up to over at brewlosophy.com. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey cause it suits my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more. Life is good, the likelihood of me. Looking for a new career? Welcome to Do HVAC Training Service Center in North Charleston. Enroll today in our comprehensive HVAC training hands-on field experience-based program, covering troubleshooting, maintenance, installation, and more on various HVAC systems and ductwork. We offer EPA and NAEP preparation and testing, along with various certifications. Enjoy payment options. Achieve certification in under 5 months. Enroll now for your new journey of skill development and career advancement. Log on to DEWHVACTrainingsc.com to inquire.